Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Ready for Merge episode. Today, I have another bi-weekly brief on the latest updates to Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development. We are going to get into a couple of different topics today, starting with Ethereum updates. I want to give everyone an update on Fusaka as well as Glamsterdam discussions. These are the next major Ethereum network-wide upgrades coming up. I also want to give some Bitcoin updates. The two topics we'll go into is a new BIP process proposal, a new upgrade to Bitcoin improvement proposal process, which, fun fact, the Ethereum improvement proposal process was based off of. And BIPs and EIPs were both based off of the Python improvement proposal process, the PIPs. Anyways, there's some new developments there. And I also want to give an update on the Bitcoin side around a new release for Ord, the Ord protocol, which is the system for ordinals. I'll get into what that is. That's not related to the Bitcoin Core protocol, but it is a very interesting side protocol that has impacted quite heavily discussions about the Bitcoin Core protocol. And it's a fun topic about how like protocol upgrades can inspire the creation of these other related protocols. So yes, that's the show for today. For anyone that's just joining, first time joining the show, welcome. I'm Christine D. Kim, the host of these shows and also the writer and the creator of the BTC Before Light newsletter and the ACD After Hours newsletter. A lot of the content that I share on the show is updates from the newsletters that I write there. So I'll give another reminder on the back end for any of the listeners of today's show. If you're interested in getting more detail about any of these topics, there's going to be links to those newsletters and the specific issues of those newsletters where you can find more information. So yeah, there you have it. It's going to be a jam-packed show as per usual. I always tell myself I need to prepare more for these, but I usually leave all this preparation to the last minute because I'm writing all the time. Okay, so starting with Ethereum updates, there's a little tag. I'm going to put a little timestamp there for people to know when they see the recording of this where the Ethereum updates start. But there it is, Ethereum updates. Let's get started with Fusaka. Fusaka is the next major Ethereum upgrade that is going to be happening. Also, as a side note, for people that are watching on the video, I have Christmas lights up, but now, and I wanted to make this video more Christmassy with the vibes, but now I realize it's messing up the lighting because every time I move my hands, the camera refocuses with the light. So I'm going to try and stop moving my hands and maybe I won't have Christmas lights for the next one. Oh, there it goes again, the lighting. But that's fine. It kind of looks like mood lighting. For anyone who's just listening, it's like the screen gets pinker. Anyways, yes, let's start with Fusaka updates. Fusaka, the next major Ethereum upgrade that is going to be happening. It is happening on December 3rd. Mainnet is coming. Mainnet upgrades. These, I cannot stress enough how big of a deal Ethereum upgrades are because every single Ethereum upgrade is a hard fork. It is a backwards incompatible upgrade. If you have not upgraded your software by December 3rd, you are going to be on a completely different protocol. You are not going to be on the same network validating the same blocks as other node operators. And so for end users that are relying on exchanges or other third-party services to connect to Ethereum, obviously you have the luxury of not having to upgrade any machines, but for these infrastructure providers, for literally any of the other people that are directly connecting to Ethereum, these are upgrades that are just very critical because there is no really grace period after December 3rd. If you haven't upgraded your software, you're not going to be able to connect to Ethereum until you upgrade. So but yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of coordination required because this is a mandatory upgrade for all node operators. And the more that the Ethereum community grows, the Ethereum ecosystem grows, the more participants and stakeholders there are to really get on board with an upgrade and to ensure that there aren't any major chain splits that happen with a certain portion of nodes validating Ethereum with an outdated version of the software and then other nodes that have upgraded, causing some kind of network disruption. Um, so that's all to say that I stress it's coming up on December 3rd. It's going to be a major event. Even though developers, Ethereum developers, this is their second upgrade this year, second major network-wide upgrade this year. Ethereum developers, for the first time, have done two really significant upgrades, both in the span of 12 months. And they're really trying to keep that cadence, keep that pace up for next year as well. No matter how frequently Ethereum upgrades, I cannot stress enough like how risky these backwards incompatible upgrades are, especially as the Ethereum ecosystem grows. Yeah, and how what a feat it is for decentralized coordination. It is a major feat, governance-wise, development-wise. That this protocol of this much value is undergoing such pretty monumental changes so frequently and have pulled it off so successfully for the last, what is it now, since 2015, for the last 10 years. Yeah, 10 years. Oh, I forgot. Yeah, Ethereum celebrated its 10-year anniversary this year. How could I forget? Okay, yes. So December 3rd, Fusaka is coming. And yeah, I did stress that it's a very involved upgrade because it's a hard fork, backwards incompatible code changes. But developers are quite confident. They are extremely confident about this upgrade, which is kind of hilarious because in the run up to this upgrade, there were quite a few, I would say, like red flags or alarms. Certain L2s did not know that their operations and their Blob transaction submissions would be breaking due to some of the changes in Fusaka. They found that out pretty late into the testing cycle for this upgrade. Home stakers had shared some concerns around the new upcoming Blob capacity limits, for which they'll have to set custom Blob, custom maximum Blob limits to their infrastructure. There were a couple of bugs discovered on testnets, which again isn't new, but it still, in my mind, would have impacted the timeline in certain ways, but it did not, or at least yeah, would make developers kind of like think twice about, oh, is this upgrade really ready for mainnet? But developers are extremely confident. And by developers, I really mean the client teams and the Ethereum Foundation researchers and developers that have been most involved in prepping the upgrade and testing it. They have all expressed on the latest All Core developers calls, these meetings on Thursdays where they coordinate these upgrades, how ready they are for these features to go live on mainnet. So that is a really positive sign. I think potentially maybe even more for the ecosystem than for themselves, to hear, to be assured that they have high hopes that the network-wide upgrade is going to go really smoothly and they don't anticipate any disruptions. I'll have another show on that day, December 3rd, actually a couple hours before the upgrade goes live, with any new last-minute updates if there are any. But developers are very confident and yeah, I think the whole ecosystem is very excited to see these code changes go live. And now on this show, I haven't really gone into in nitty-gritty detail all the features that are going into Fusaka. There's quite a bit. It's the largest upgrade by number of EIPs. I don't know if I've ever said this on the show or even on my social media profiles or even on my Substack. Pectra was the largest upgrade by number of EIPs, but Fusaka has one more. It's a one EIP larger, and there's a lot. So I'm not going to go into all of them because that's just too much, and I already have so much to talk about. And the main feature is PeerDAS, to be quite honest. I could go into that, but I am going to go into one code change on this show that is going into Fusaka because it's a special request from someone who's listening to this show. They reached out to me last week, Kawablo. I hope I said your name right. But whoever you are, Kawablo, this part of the show is for you. I really do care about what you guys are interested in. And Kawablo had asked, okay, there's this EIP 7918 that's going into Fusaka. What does it do? So here I go. Here's the quick TLDR on that one. It's an important one to know. EIP 7918 is blob base fee bounded by execution cost. A little background for this EIP. Blob transactions. These are transactions that are specifically designed to allow users to embed or to store arbitrary data onto Ethereum. Ethereum wasn't expressly built to be a data availability layer for layer 2s, for these other protocols to batch transaction data and commit it down to Ethereum, kind of like a bulletin board, because this data is ephemeral. It doesn't stay forever on Ethereum. And with the prior upgrades, developers have introduced an entirely new transaction type, a special dedicated block space for these types of transactions, for this kind of activity, for arbitrary data to be stored cheaply, temporarily on the Ethereum blockchain. There's a dedicated fee market. Ethereum developers are really enhancing what Ethereum, when it first launched in 2015, was not built to do. And it's funny because on the Bitcoin side, this is what Bitcoin protocol developers expressly do not want to happen on Bitcoin. And they're thinking about ways to limit and kind of like change how user behavior happens so that if arbitrary data is going to be embedded onto the blockchain, to do it in a very specific way. For Ethereum, they are wanting to encourage this activity because they want to scale through layer 2s, through these alternative protocols. And so they've introduced this transaction called a Blob transaction. And this Blob transaction can carry quite a large amount of arbitrary data. And there are two ways in which blob transactions are priced. The price of a blob transaction is essentially the sum of these two components of the fee, of these two parts. The first is the execution gas fee. So this is simply the payment that a blob submitter must pay for sending that transaction onto the execution layer of Ethereum, which is really the part of the Ethereum protocol that executes all the operations, keeps track of all the accounts and the balances of every single user, all of the activity that's happening on chain. And it basically packages the intent for this kind of data to be stored onto the consensus layer, which is the layer of Ethereum that provides Ethereum's decentralized security. Every single block that's submitted, every single transaction that's submitted, there is a decentralized set of validators that verify these blocks, make sure that it's formatted correctly, doesn't break any of the protocol rules of Ethereum. And that's all dictated by the consensus layer. So every time there's a blob transaction that's submitted, there's a fee. Part of the fee is simply to propagate that transaction through the execution layer and have it executed. And that's one part of the fee. And then there's a second part, which is the part for the blob data itself. And this is the cost for storing that blob data and having it propagated by all of the validators. That is more the consensus layer part of the blob transaction fee. So there's two parts. There's the execution layer part of the fee and the consensus layer part of the fee. And the blob fee itself, the fee for simply storing the data on Ethereum, that fee originally was could be very cheap. If there wasn't a lot of demand for blobs, then that cost, that part of the blob transaction fee, could be virtually zero. You can't actually code like a zero cost transaction or operation, anything on Ethereum, but you can set the base to something extremely minuscule in terms of cost. aka 1 Wei. Wei is the smallest unit of denomination that you can have for ETH, which is the native currency of Ethereum. And that was the base fee for the blobs, being blob, the blob, the binarily large objects that are being stored on Ethereum temporarily. That was the base for the blob fee component. And I think developers at the time was very optimistic that there would be a high demand for blobs, and so the blob fee would more or less reach price discovery and maintain price discovery. However, the blob market is extremely volatile, and there have been several moments where blobs have been virtually costless, have dropped to a payment of like 1 Wei or nothing, virtually nothing. And these people that are submitting blobs, all they're doing is paying that like fee for the execution layer part, for simply being able to send the transaction through Ethereum and package the blob data. And so what this EIP does is it adjusts the base for the blob fee. It adjusts it so that the blob base fee cannot drop below a threshold that is proportional to the execution layer base fee. So as I mentioned just earlier, there's 2 fee markets. There's fee markets for regular Ethereum transactions, and then Ethereum developers had dedicated a new fee market for blobs. But this other fee market, the original fee market, both work similarly in terms of the dynamics. There's both a base fee for transactions, and there's also priority tips that go directly to the validators to indicate kind of like a time sensitivity to certain transactions. But on the for regular transactions, the fee market for regular transactions, there is a base fee that dynamically adjusts depending on demand for block space. So if you have a lot of transactions being submitted to Ethereum and the block space being utilized quite a lot, then you'll see the base fee for those transactions increase. And so this EIP ties that execution base fee into the calculations for the blob base fee and ensures that the blob base fee cannot drop below a new floor, a new threshold. So the intent of this EIP, the motivation for it, is really to encourage faster price discovery for blob transactions. Instead of the blob transactions potentially hitting like 1 Wei, or at least a portion of the fees for blob transactions hitting 1 Wei, and then having to climb back up to reach the right price for like depending on the supply and demand dynamics for blobs at the time. It just elevates the threshold and the floor for that portion of the fee for blob transactions. And ultimately, aside from price discovery, I think it also just is intended to hopefully bring more revenue to Ethereum through L2s. By, of course, increasing and changing up the threshold for blob transactions. I think there's a hope that this will allow more fees to be burned through blob transactions. So for blob transactions, similarly to regular Ethereum transactions, there's the base fee that's burned. It's taken out of circulation of ETH supply. However much ETH you pay for the base fee, it's burned. And then there's also a tip that goes to validators. I don't imagine that any blob transaction submitters are actually paying quite a bit for tip, as I still believe that the supply for block space for blobs is actually still larger than demand. And with upcoming scaling improvements, so with Fusaka, a couple of other improvements that are coming up is a doubling to blob capacity. So the block space for blobs is going to be more than doubling in the short weeks following Fusaka activation. So that's even more like supply coming in. I can't imagine that there's a lot of revenue going directly to validators via Blob transaction tips. But I imagine that over time, the intent is that this is an EIP that is going to allow more revenue to flow from layer twos to layer one. Because if some of my listeners recall, if you've been around in the Ethereum ecosystem for the better part of this year and have been following along with some of the discussions, there have been a lot of questions around value accrual. Exactly how many L2s and L2 activity do we need for Ethereum to really get a cut of all that activity and be sustainable with all the users basically leaving Ethereum to go to these L2s? Like, what is the right value accrual mechanism? And this is an EIP that tries to create more robust value accrual mechanisms from layer twos to layer one. That said, I do believe EIP 7918 is one of those EIPs it's just the beginning. Ethereum developers love tweaking with the fee market of Ethereum with transactions. So I don't imagine that this is going to be the last code change that we talk about as it relates to pricing blobs and ensuring that the supply demand dynamics for blobs and the value accrual between L1 and L2 is in the eyes of the Ethereum developers and the Ethereum community correctly valuing what the protocol is doing. So more changes likely to come up. And it's interesting, alongside this EIP, when there was discussions around Fusaka, there was definitely talks about, well, why don't we just do just a one and done increase to the blob base fee? So instead of it being one way, why don't we just increase it to like 100 way or 1,000 way? But this EIP was chosen because it's a bit more dynamic. Again, the floor will adjust based on the execution base fee, just the base fee for regular Ethereum transactions. So yeah, it was a bit more of an involved EIP to implement rather than just like a one and done increase to the floor. But that's going into Fusaka. And yeah, I hope that was a helpful explanation, Coablo. For everyone that is potentially, if you have any nodes or if you have any infrastructure that is directly connecting to the Ethereum blockchain, please make sure that your nodes and your infrastructure are updated to the latest software. There's also quite a few like ancillary software that is not directly connected to the protocol, but will also have to be upgraded in preparation for Fusaka on mainnet on December 3rd. There's staking software that also has been updated for Fusaka. There's MEV Boost, another software for validators to earn additional rewards on chain. Also, that's a software that's been updated in accordance with some of the changes coming into Fusaka. So please just be extra attentive to whatever services that you rely on for your Ethereum chain activities. And if you're simply an end user that's relying on other infrastructure providers to do that heavy lifting for you, make sure you follow up with them to make sure that your infrastructure provider is aware of the upgrade coming up and is well prepared for that upgrade. I wanted to talk about Fossil and Glamsterdam, but I'm afraid I think I'll have to just move on to Bitcoin updates. I will just note for my listeners, now that Fusaka is wrapping up, the next upgrade after Fusaka is the Glamsterdam upgrade. And there is an ongoing discussion about whether this proposal called Fossil should be included in Glamsterdam because of the benefits that Fossil could have to the censorship resistance of Ethereum. It will create more, it will strengthen the transaction inclusion guarantees of Ethereum. So it will allow validators, it will reduce the amount of like control that whatever block proposal or whatever validator is responsible for proposing a block on Ethereum at that time, to not give them unilateral control over what transactions get included in that block. So if that validator is a censoring validator, intentionally not including certain transactions, this is a code change that would prevent that validator from having complete control of the entire block. There will be an inclusion list, a set of transactions that must be included in the block that is determined by a committee of validators in the prior block, from the prior block. I'm not going to get too into this because of the lack of time, but I will note that it does not seem likely that Fossil is going into Glamsterdam. Developers are feeling confident about having Fossil be included in the next upgrade after Glamsterdam, which on the consensus layer side has been named the Heka upgrade. So that is the direction that developers are leaning towards, and there's most consensus for. Developers have said they will rediscuss this next Thursday on their all core developers call. So I will give you an update in 2 weeks' time. More on Fossil. Hopefully, I will prioritize that topic a little bit more on the next show. But let's move on to Bitcoin updates. And the very kind of last 10 minutes or so for the show, I want to give the little text here. Haha, Bitcoin updates. Okay. 2 Bitcoin updates. The first is that there is a Bitcoin improvement proposal number 3, a Bitcoin improvement proposal number 3 that BIP3 that has been proposed by one of the BIP editors. Merch is his name, and okay. So the quick note actually on this is not important, but every time I talk about Bitcoin developers or even Ethereum developers, many of these developers use pseudonyms, and I have met some of these developers in real life, and so I know whether they are a man or a woman. But just from the pseudonym, it's hard to tell sometimes if you've never met them before, if they're a man or a woman. So very often I'll just say, for to be as accurate as possible, I'll just say they, because that's neutral, because I don't know. But other times I know. Anyways, I'm very confident Merch is the guy. But yes, so Merch, he proposed BIP3. And BIP3 has a bunch of I would say, pretty minor changes to the BIP process. Nothing, alarming or that changes how Bitcoin improvement proposals are run through the Bitcoin governance process. In nothing like kind of that would change it in major ways. There's a couple of tweaks to the BIP editor role that will limit the BIP editor role to be more focused on checking BIP proposals for formatting and appropriate metadata attached to the BIP, rather than giving BIP editors any like documented power over changing the content of a BIP. There's more additional language in BIP3 than there was in prior BIPs, delineating between the different BIP types, like an informational BIP versus a process BIP versus a specifications BIP. There's a bit more clarifying language there. There's also a couple of improvements that adjust the BIP process to take away from parts of the BIP process that weren't very helpful and that community members were not, the Ethereum ecosystem was not really relying on. So one of them is the removal of the comment section around a BIP that summarizes the comments that have been given for a BIP. There wasn't very much traction with that feature. So with BIP3, that's going to be removed. A couple of additional language in BIP3 that didn't exist in the prior process documents, BIP1 and BIP2, around AI, explicit language around please don't submit BIPs that are entirely written by an AI that isn't of high quality. Make sure that the BIPs that you propose are high quality. And if you do use AI, make sure you disclose where you've used it. These kinds of, little tweaks here and there. And so that has been formally proposed by Merch for adoption to formally replace BIP2, which was the prior process document. And so while these details are not that exciting, or not that controversial, I would say, although there was some discussion I saw around BIP3, around the AI language, between some of the BIP editors. Oh, these changes are not that exciting. I will say what's very exciting about the BIP process is that for the first time in Bitcoin's history, these are code changes that will be stewarded by a group of BIP editors rather than just one. When the governance process of Bitcoin was first formalized, and when I say formalized, I even use that term very loosely because for Ethereum and Bitcoin, governance is a very informal process. But when documents like BIP1, BIP2 came into creation, there was only one BIP editor, one dedicated individual to review BIPs and make sure that they are in accordance with the BIP1 and the BIP2 the rules outlined in those documents. So BIP1, I believe the author of it was Amir Taki, and he was the original BIP editor. That torch was taken on by Luke Dash Jr., who was the only BIP editor for quite a long time. And I believe Luke Dash Jr. was the one who authored BIP2. So BIP3, authored by Merch, it has taken into comments and taken feedback from a group of 5 other BIP editors, because starting last year in 2024, the Bitcoin community elected more BIP editors to take care of this backlog of BIPs. That, of course, was a lot for one individual to handle, Luke. And so now there's a group of 6 BIP editors. And so aside from the kind of minor changes in BIP3, I think it's just exciting to see the BIP process and the practical day-to-day of BIP editing be stewarded and shepherded by more than just one individual. I think that marks a significant upgrade in terms of decentralization for the Bitcoin governance process. So yeah, I think that's definitely a win there. And one other topic that I wanted to talk about as it relates to Bitcoin updates on the show is the Ord V0.2.3 release. It came out over the weekend. This has nothing to do with the Bitcoin Core protocol, but it's a really fun protocol that if you don't know about it, I'm glad I get to share it with you. Ord is a protocol that basically links arbitrary data to the smallest unit of Bitcoin. So for Ethereum, the smallest unit of its native cryptocurrency, ETH, is Wei. For Bitcoin, the smallest unit is Satoshis. There's like 2.1 like quadrillion Satoshis that will be in circulation in Bitcoin forever. Well, I don't know, so long as the Bitcoin protocol continues to exist. And so what Ord does is it numbers every single Satoshi, and it can scan the Satoshis for linked embedded arbitrary data. And these embedded data, they're called inscriptions. And so Ord is a protocol for scanning for inscriptions, for attaching linking these arbitrary data to a specific Satoshi. And then with that Satoshi, you can trade it around. You can send it to another account, buy, trade, sell it. And Ord is short for ordinals. This system was created, this protocol was created by a Bitcoin developer named Casey Rodermore. And he shared, again, this weekend, that there's been some new features, new optimizations added to Ord. And it's important to note that, again, Bitcoin Core, it has no native numbering scheme for Satoshis. It does not scan. There's no native functionality to scan for inscriptions in Bitcoin Core. This is a completely additional protocol on top. But people love it. A lot of people have been really excited about this release. There's still more innovations happening in the Ord protocol. One of them that came into the latest Ord release is this introduction of galleries. If you wanted to have multiple inscriptions linked together into a collection, there is one way to do it. One way to do it through this parent-child relationship that was introduced in a prior Ord release, but now they're introducing galleries for any users that do want to make those links, but for some reason have not been able to use the parent-child feature, or the parent-child feature was introduced after they had already created their collection of inscriptions. So there's these things called galleries. Anybody can link various inscriptions together into a gallery. So what's a little bit different with the parent-child feature is that parent-child feature will prove provenance. The person who has created the parent, only they can link with the children. But for galleries, there is no guaranteed like provenance. Like anybody can link any inscription together in a gallery. There's other kind of metadata fields that have been added to the latest release of Ords that will allow users to attach titles and traits to their inscriptions. And so all of these features are really intended to try and bring more data, allow more data to be able to be natively verified on chain rather than having a lot of data live off chain, and for people that are very excited about inscriptions to not have to have these other alternative sources for verifying data related to inscriptions. So slowly but surely, kind of like a really cool maturing side of Bitcoin innovation that has happened over the last couple of years. And I want to note has really been possible through the Bitcoin soft fork upgrade that happened 4 years ago, the Taproot upgrade around this time. And that upgrade was not originally intended to nurture and to encourage the creation of protocols like ordinals. Taproot was primarily intended to for the scalability benefits that it would bring to Bitcoin, and also the privacy benefits that it would bring to Bitcoin users. But lo and behold, there was creative interpretations of the new protocol rules, of the new features of the protocol that were introduced with Taproot that have allowed ordinals. I think it's a great example of how permissionless innovation is on decentralized protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Nobody, like Casey Roedermore, the creator of ordinals, he didn't need to get the permission of Bitcoin Core developers to do this. Anyone can permissionlessly innovate on the protocols that are being on permission of those protocols like Bitcoin. There's no one can block you or stop you from doing this. And that also means that interpretation of the consensus rules and of the protocol itself has quite a lot of power in the way that protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum are valued. Yes, developers in the community and the way that they evolve these protocols itself, that does, of course, have a big say in how the protocol gets used. But there are unintended consequences, and again, permissionless innovation that could introduce an entirely new use case or interpretation of the rules. And in that sense, it could change the narrative and how people actually use Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. So kind of a really cool reminder that Bitcoin is uncensorable even from the angle of how people use Bitcoin, and what they want to do with it. And oftentimes that leads to kind of like unpredictable outcomes. That's why I don't think like the value and the use case for Bitcoin is just one and done as peer-to-peer money. I think that there are these kinds of examples that show that perhaps the use case is more multifaceted than perhaps even certain developers intend it to be. And of course, there's still more discussions on how the protocol could be adjusted to really clarify and restrict rules even further for a specific use case. But when it comes to code and when it comes to a permissionless protocol like Bitcoin, you never know what kind of creativity and innovation could arise. So yes, very, very cool, exciting innovations happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I am going to wrap the episode with all of those updates on the Ethereum side and the Bitcoin side. Thank you to all of my listeners for listening to another biweekly brief on Bitcoin and Ethereum. You are officially caught up on what's ready for merge in Bitcoin and Ethereum. A couple of notes on the back end. Next week's show, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break for next week. There will be no new Ready for Merge episode coming out next week. It is a bit of a holiday here in the U.S. American Thanksgiving is coming up, so I'm going to be taking some time to just spend with family. So no show next week. However, I'll be back the following Wednesday with a new biweekly brief. That is actually the day that Fusaka on the Ethereum side is going to be going live on mainnet. So it'll be, I think, an exciting show. For some of my listeners that are very familiar with my Substack, I just want to make a quick note. I learned about it this morning. There is not going to be a developers meeting happening on Thursday. There was a last minute cancellation because a lot of the developers are already meeting in person for DevConnect in Buenos Aires. So heads up, tomorrow's ACD After Hours newsletter is likely going to be a little bit of a fun newsletter. I haven't quite decided exactly what I'm going to do, but I'm going to make it different. It's not going to feature a call summary and call insights. It'll feature something else, some other insight that I have. So stay tuned for that. I wanted to give you guys a heads up. It could be a little Thanksgiving special for that newsletter. And if you're interested in getting it but haven't subscribed to my newsletters, you should. For every topic that I talked about, I'm going to have links in the show notes for where you can get more information about some of these updates. If you like the episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to Ready for Merge, the show. Share it if you think it would be helpful for other people who would be interested in learning more about how the world's most valuable open source protocols are evolving. And that is it. Thank you. Thank you guys again for listening. I will talk to you all in 2 weeks' time with another biweekly brief. See ya.